Sorry I haven't been able to spend any time with you today. You'll find out in a minute why.
It was the spring of 2001, and John Howard had been on a political roller coaster.
We went through just about everything, including political strength, turning to political adversity, turning to political challenge. It was a term with all seasons.
But events in the United States would change the face of politics worldwide. The war on terror would divide the nation, deliver John Howard a major election victory, and win him the respect of two of the most powerful men in the world.
Yeah, he may not look like somebody who plays in the scrum on the Australian rugby team, but he was, believe me, he's plenty tough.
You know, if you were in difficulty and he was with you, you knew it wouldn't matter how difficult it got, he would still be with you.
On the 8th of September 2001, John Howard arrived in Washington ahead of his first meeting with the US President George W. Bush.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here.
The Australian Embassy had a packed itinerary waiting, starting with a barbecue with the capital's movers and shakers.
How are you, Richard? Great to see you. It was the Sunday night, and it was a wonderful occasion. It's as if the whole administration, bar the president, were there.
There was music, there was cheerfulness, and if you like, the world was good.
The next day, the two leaders finally came face to face.
May God bless Australia, and may God bless America. I first met him on September the 10th, 2001. And we were having a celebration of the U.S.-Australian relationship. And, you know, I liked him instantly. He seemed like a no-nonsense guy.
Honor, the Prime Minister's here.
Then we drove up in his car to the White House and had a long discussion.
Australia's a great friend, and we're so honored he's here.
No mention of terrorism. We talked about Russia and America. We talked about you know, the broad Middle Eastern situation in a tangential kind of way, and about Australian-US relations.
As dawn broke the next day, John Howard's major worry was thousands of miles away.
Hey, Graham. I remember that morning of the 11th of September very vividly. I went for a walk. I took a phone call from Peter Costello.
He called me actually to talk about what we were worrying about back in Australia, which was the collapse of Ansett.
And then I continued on to my hotel, and I was getting ready for a news conference with Australian journalists, and Tony O'Leary, my press secretary, knocked at the door to talk about arrangements. And before he talked about them, he said, a plane has just hit the World Trade Center.
And at that point, I mean, it seemed like an appalling accident.
And a few minutes later, he knocked on the door again, and he said, another plane's hit the other tower. And you know, the whole building is in flames. And both of us knew instinctively that there was, you know, something far more than an accident. It wasn't an accident.
The terror attacks weren't over. Washington was the next target.
Could I just say before I start on any domestic thing how...
We heard a loud explosion, looked out the window, and the Pentagon had just been hit. Immediately asked where the Prime Minister was, and he was having a press conference in the floor below.
Well, I pulled the curtains aside, and you could see the smoke rising from the Pentagon. And everybody started to think, well, this is some kind of attack.
The Secret Service just rounded everyone up.
The head of my security detail, the Secret Service, George Edwards, came and said, look, we're getting out of here. I haven't lost anybody yet, and I don't intend to start today.
But it was a surreal experience, Washington, D.C. on that day. When we walked out into the street, the city was numb. We were numb.
On the other side of the world, the acting Prime Minister, John Anderson, took charge.
I mean, like so many other people, I thought this must be just some horrific spoof. It can't really be happening.
You knew this was something big, something we'd never seen before in our lifetime. It was chilling footage.
I went in at about 5:30 the next morning. We had the first of many, many meetings with all of the security people that morning.
The mood of the meeting was sombre. People weren't sure if this was the precursor to some sustained activity. We were expecting a second wave of attacks of some description.
We had to account for every plane that we knew would be in Australian airspace, and we had to begin securing Australian airports in case there was some kind of attack on Australia.
As the dust settled around the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the enormity of the attack began to sink in.
There would obviously be a massive hunt to find out who was behind this.
So while we didn't know definitively during that afternoon exactly who was responsible, I think we had a pretty clear idea that it was from Afghanistan and that Al-Qaeda was involved.
John Howard had a ringside seat at one of the most dramatic moments in history. Then, as America went into lockdown, the Prime Minister kept his appointment at a defiant joint sitting of Congress.
The chair's exam.
John Howard's gesture in going, you can scarcely exaggerate the importance. It's a moment that everyone in the Congress will remember.
The chair wishes to acknowledge, however, the presence of the Prime Minister here today.
And it was quite a moving moment. I was the sole foreign representative, and the Speaker acknowledged me, and I remember being very touched by the standing ovation that I got.
It was a very, very emotional moment. I think probably one of the most emotional moments of his prime ministership.
Having been in Washington and seen it firsthand, I think it got to him emotionally. It wasn't just his head, it was his heart.
We have to accept that this is an occasion where we should stand shoulder to shoulder with the Americans, because this is not just an assault on America, it's an assault on the way of life that we hold dear in common. This was the equivalent of planes flying into the Sydney Harbour Bridge or the Opera House. And I only have to say that for people to realise how we as Australians would have felt if that had happened.
By the time the Prime Minister headed for home, his resolve was even firmer.
My mobile rang and it was John Howard calling from Air Force 2. We started discussing this whole question of whether we should invoke the ANZUS alliance.
The ANZUS alliance says that if there's an attack on the metropolitan territory of either of the parties, the Australia or US, it's considered a joint attack requiring consultation for a joint response.
Well, what that meant was that if there were some kind of military action, we would be part of it.
He instantly realized that we faced a world different, than we thought it was going to be.
And there was no doubt in my mind from the day after the attack we would be beside the Americans in retaliating. I had no doubt.
And so, in many ways, our friendship was forged in fire, the fire of war.
Good morning.
If John Howard had new and powerful friends overseas, he also had renewed popularity at home.
Thank you.
God's blessings on every decision you make.
Well, that's very nice. Thank you.
On the 5th of October 2001, when John Howard called the federal election, he would be clear favourite to win his third term in office.
This is a time, of course, to choose strength and purpose and stability over the alternative.
At a time of bewilderment, a time of world crisis, the natural tendency of the voter is to stay with the incumbent.
Prime Minister, this is Howard.
Great to see you. How are you? Great to see you. Well, the mood I picked up as I went around the country was increasingly that at the end of the day, people would stick to the government because they felt we were handling the economy very well, and they also agreed with our position on border protection and on national security generally.
If border protection was a vote-winning issue for the government, fate was about to intervene. Out at sea, Operation Relics was in full swing, and the Navy was busy turning back boatloads of asylum seekers. The day after the election was called, HMAS Adelaide encountered a sinking boat, codenamed Civ 4, packed with people heading for Australia. The Adelaide's commander, Norman Banks, believed that some adults were throwing children overboard. That claim was passed on immediately to the government.
It was almost a throwaway line. That was the first report they received. It had no policy implications. It was a piece of colour, if you will. Somebody threatening to throw a child overboard.
Hello. How are you?
But in the heat of an election campaign, this piece of colour would soon become much more. The government launched a media offensive.
A number of children have been thrown overboard.
But our policy remains quite resolute.
I regard these as some of the most disturbing practices that I have come across in the time that I've been involved in public life.
We are not going to be intimidated out of our policy by this kind of behaviour. I want to make that very clear.
Yeah, it's interesting that on the morning that the report about children overboard was made to me, it was already in the media. I mean, ministers were already in the public place talking about it before I'd even heard about it.
If I had been seen to sit on a report as serious as this, I would have been seen to be derelict in my responsibilities.
The government's haste in grabbing the headlines would soon bring it under pressure. The Navy had taken photos of people in the water, and the media was clamouring to see them.
Then I rang the CDF and I said, look, I've got press people ringing up saying you've got photos, you've got this, you know this, da-da-da. I said, is there any reason, and the press were calling for us to release the photos. So I said, is there any reason why we can't just release these photos?
Now joining us in the studio is the Defence Minister, Peter Reith. Welcome back to the Drive program.
Thank you very much.
You've got some photos to show this, have you?
Well, it did happen. The fact is the children were thrown into the water.
But the photos Peter Reith offered as proof did not show children being thrown in the water on the 7th of October. They showed people being rescued the following day. Somewhere between the Defence Department and the Minister's office, the captions that had made this clear had been removed.
The Navy also released photos this afternoon of 2 young asylum seekers floating in the sea as proof that they were thrown overboard.
When I saw pictures on the 7:30 report, without the headings on the pictures. I phoned Chris Barry to say, these are the wrong pictures. These are pictures of people being rescued. These are not pictures of people being thrown in the water. I said, will you tell the minister? He said, yes, I'll tell the minister.
Peter Reith and I had a testy conversation about it.
I don't think I ever had a testy conversation with Chris Barry about anything. I really don't.
I think Reith was annoyed that this thing seemed to be not fixed, not organised, not under control. So Peter Reith was, he was wanting to put out a story and make a big thing of it as minister, and somehow or another the department didn't seem to be able to get its act together. I think that was testiness.
Well, I don't remember ever having a conversation with Chris Barry about the validity of the photos.
By now, real doubts had surfaced within Defence about whether any children had been thrown overboard at all.
I would have said that 3 days after Banks may have said that there were children being thrown in the water, he had reached the conclusion that there were not children being thrown in the water. And my expectation was that Chris Barry and others would have had the same information.
Crucially, the Chief of the Defence Force did not change his advice to Peter Reith.
Very timely and... I said 2 reports where there are doubts that there were children thrown overboard, and I have made it clear that unless somebody gives me evidence to the contrary, my advice to the government stands.
So he was giving Norm Banks' first statement the benefit of the doubt right through. But Norm clarified his statement about 3 days after his first one. Why Chris Barry didn't know or wasn't told is, I don't know, but it was clearly a problem.
I think it was reasonable for Chris Barry to form the judgment that he did, and it was certainly reasonable for me to rely upon his judgment. But, it's just a difficult situation. Things happen in a hurry. People, pass the information on, and that's what happened.
In the days that followed, no one in the Defence Force or the government took the time to clarify the truth. The question is, why?
It wouldn't be hard for me to say that in a political context, this story was playing into the stance that the government at the time was taking. And therefore, to get more mileage out of it, you build in stops to let information be clarified because it's in your own interest to keep the story running.
I don't believe that this information was deliberately used and manipulated. Now, we were given it, we believed it. Philip Ruddock and I initially made some statements based on it, and then we stopped talking about it. And frankly, it went right out of my mind. It wasn't a big issue. I had other issues on my mind.
Indeed, he did. The United States had invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter, enabling it to respond to an act of aggression. There was a worldwide determination to hit back at those deemed responsible for the September 11th attacks. And it was clear Australia would join a global coalition in taking action against Afghanistan.
The trail was traced back to Afghanistan and to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban.
Last night, President Bush telephoned me. He indicated that the United States would like to activate the commitment that Australia had made to join the coalition force. I indicated that Australia would respond. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot. I'm very well.
I'm going to bless you.
He is my colleague. He is my friend. Will you welcome Mrs. Howard and the Prime Minister of Australia, John Howard?
John Howard now had 2 powerful weapons in his bid for re-election: national security and border protection.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come. I came up with that line on the spot. I mean, there's a lot of mythology about some of my lines. It was not research-driven. It was not something I'd thought about before or discussed with anybody before. It just came to me.
As he said it, I thought that's the line that's going to capture the mood of the population.
It was incredibly powerful, incredibly powerful.
I certainly thought it was smart politically, but on a human basis, I was concerned.
When I first saw the slogan, I just went gulp.
It wasn't about a dog whistle. It was about a sense of sovereignty and a sense of control, and you got that through John Howard.
I hope nothing goes. I hope I don't.
3 days out from the election, John Howard seemed headed for certain victory.
Look after Chris.
But doubts surfaced in the media about what really happened with Civ 4. Now the government was being accused of lying about the children overboard affair.
A new controversy over claims that asylum seekers threw children into the sea has overshadowed John Howard's second last day of campaigning.
With the Chief of the Defence Force, Chris Barry, out of the country, the acting CDF, Angus Houston, took a bold decision to reopen the children overboard issue. As he told a Senate inquiry some months later, he rang Peter Reith in an attempt to finally clarify things.
Fundamentally, there was nothing to suggest that women and children had been thrown into the water.
It was clear to Angus Houston that the information was there and ought to be brought to the attention of the minister.
I mean, as I heard it from Angus, you know, he had a couple of days in Chris's office. He'd had a bit of a rifling around the papers. He'd sort of had a bit of a worry about what had happened. And my answer was, well, mate, you better check it out properly. And you should talk to Chris Barry, because he was the one who did it all. He's been in charge of it. You talk to him.
Oh, look, I think Angus did exactly the right thing. I mean, it was his call. He had all the power and authority of the CDF of the day.
But I have no regrets whatsoever saying to Angus, which I think any Defence Minister would say, is, look, I've had advice from the Chief of the Defence Force. He's out of the country for 2 days. It can wait until he gets back and you can talk to him. And then the ball is in their court.
On reflection, I think the government, Peter Reith, I guess, or maybe John Howard, chose to accept whichever advice they liked, which we all know was mine.
Look, I'm sorry it got so confused and perhaps wasn't handled well, and I'd have to say not just by me, but, you know, including others around me. But I wasn't... I mean, this idea that this was sort of a devious, nasty, brutal tactic by the government for political advantage is just completely untrue.
Minister, you might like to...
Don't fall in.
Get rid of that.
Peter Reith's decision not to respond to the advice of Angus Houston was the final act of his political career.
What do you think? You like it? Yeah, I like it.
He retired at that election, and the government went to the people defending the claim that children had been thrown into the sea.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to see you. James, thank you.
You miserable little man, you got no vision for Australia.
On the 10th of November 2001, the coalition was returned with an increased majority. John Howard had won a third term.
People have said, would you have won in 2001 without Tampa, without September 11, without border protection? The answer is yes, I believe we would have won without any of those things.
There was a strong swing to us amongst the traditional Labor voters who wanted border protection and believed that only John Howard could deliver it.
In a phrase, John Howard was the man for the times.
The times did seem to suit John Howard. He'd formed a close friendship with the most powerful man on earth. But in this third term, where would that friendship lead?
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger
You know, for me, and I think the same was true for John Howard, after September the 11th, you know, we just had a very clear view that this was a security threat faced by all of us, that we stood with America, and that was that.
Iraq's track record suggested that it might, as a country, irresponsibly hand WMD capacity to terrorist groups. And that was a view that I had, it was a view that Tony Blair had, and it was a view that some of the intelligence people had, not all of them, but some of them.
I have to say, even up until the day I retired, I never saw any evidence that said suddenly we had to go off and do a job in Iraq.
If weapons of mass destruction were the reason for action against Saddam Hussein, he had the ability to resolve the issue. He could simply allow UN weapons inspectors to return to Iraq. But Saddam Hussein refused and seemed intent on playing a game of brinkmanship with the United Nations.
I had certainly, in late 2002, had not decided, and I'm sure John hadn't either, that you support military action, but you decided that it was one or the other, either done peacefully or done through military action, but it had to be done.
I didn't, at any stage in 2002, say, George, I guarantee, come what may, if you invade Iraq, we'll be part of it. But he would have been entitled to believe that there was a real possibility that we would be part of it, and we planned accordingly.
Well, I just took the man for his word. It's one thing about Howard. It's easy to understand where he's coming from, and when he gives you his word, he'll keep it.
The irony of all of this is that if Saddam Hussein had chosen to comply fully in, say, June 2002 with those mandatory Security Council resolutions, then who knows whether he would have survived.
In Australia, opposition to an attack on Iraq was growing.
Oh, hello. I'd just like to ask the Prime Minister that before he commits our sons to any war overseas, I hope he'll include his own.
Well, I've been asked that. There wasn't a lot of support in the Australian community for us being involved against Iraq. I knew that.
You know, there was no doubt in my mind that John Howard understood the stakes. In other words, you know, some leaders didn't really fully appreciate the struggle. This and I call it an ideological struggle because it is.
But government is about policy, not just politics. And it was good policy to get rid of the threat of Saddam Hussein. And it's good policy to see the back of Saddam Hussein.
If John Howard still had any doubts about following America, the next major terrorist attack would harden his resolve.
I was rung in the very early hours of the morning to be told that there had been an explosion in Bali and it was possible some Australians had been hurt.
It kept rolling through my mind. This will not stand. You cannot do this to our countrymen and women. Outrage.
"202 people were killed, including 88 Australians. Many more suffered terrible injuries.
This was Australia as a terrorist target, unambiguously, for the first time. I think up until the Bali bombing, people thought the Americans were the terrorist targets. After Bali, they knew Australians were the targets of terrorists.
I felt sick because it was sort of holiday central for so many young Australians.
He was then going through what, you know, I went through and other Americans went through when, I mean, the reality of this extremist movement came home when he had to hug and console those who lost their loved ones.
I know it's a corny thing to say, but any innocence that we may have retained about the realities of the modern world was totally blown away that morning or that evening in Bali.
As the shockwaves from the Bali bombing subsided, John Howard faced a difficult question. Had his support for the United States made Australians a target?
I knew he'd come under a lot of pressure, you know, because that's what happens. People say, why has this been done to us? You know, maybe it's because we've been doing the wrong. You know, there's all sorts of, speculations about it. But in the end, what you're left with as a Prime Minister in that situation is a lot of grieving families and a nation that is shocked. And that's a difficult thing to deal with.
22-year-old Josh Deegan was one of the nearly 200 people killed in the Bali bomb blasts. 6 weeks later, his father has hit out at the Prime Minister, blaming his son's death on Australia's support for the United States.
Australia seems to be following that blindly. And we are, as a country, a soft target.
If I'd lost a son and I had a particular political view of the world, I'd link the two and I'd express my feelings. I mean, I don't have any difficulty, although I might not agree with him, and I clearly didn't agree with him for a moment, I understood why he would react in that way.
By early 2003, war clouds were looming. For Australia, any final decision to join an invasion force would depend on having evidence supplied by America and Britain that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Knowing this, John Howard left Australia for a final round of diplomatic talks.
I wanted to have some last-minute discussions with President Bush. I knew that if there was going to be a military operation, it was going to occur sometime not long after I got back. I wanted to have those discussions with both the American President and the British Prime Minister. I wanted to be satisfied about the consistency of the arguments and our understanding, I guess, of any last-minute intelligence.
You know, Saddam's got to disarm him. If he doesn't, we'll disarm him.
From Washington and London, the message was clear. Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction.
The threat that preoccupies not just this country, but Australia, other countries right throughout the world, is the threat of disorder and chaos as a result of terrorist groups or rogue, unstable states with chemical, biological, potentially nuclear weapons capability.
John Howard also met the head of the British Secret Service.
And they had an extended discussion about the information that underpinned the assertions or the comments that Blair and Bush and others were making about Saddam Hussein, weapons of mass destruction and the like. What came through in that conversation to me was that they seemed to be very certain of their information and very willing to vouch for their sources.
We accept intelligence on so many things around the world which are outside of our own capabilities to prove or disprove. We accept it every day. I mean, you get a crystal clear satellite photograph of a tin-roofed warehouse in Iraq. You couldn't ask for a better image, but with an arrow pointing at it saying, possible anthrax storage facility. Now, that's the part that's imperfect.
The Prime Minister would fly home to the biggest anti-war protests in the country's history, convinced that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction.
And I knew it was unpopular in Australia, and it was getting to be unpopular in America. But the thing about John Howard was he wasn't willing to chase popularity polls to sacrifice doing what was right.
This was, to me, a classic example that from time to time, if you believe something is right, you have to go against public opinion. And this was certainly the case with Iraq.
On the 18th of March 2003, with Saddam Hussein refusing to comply with the United States ultimatum to leave Iraq, President Bush rang John Howard and asked Australia to be part of the invasion force.
I'd indicated that I needed a proper request and that we'd have to have a cabinet meeting.
It was a worrying period, it's the word I would use, and when the cabinet made the decision, it was in a sullen mood.
I went around and I asked each minister, because this is going to war, and it was controversial, and everybody went along with it.
To my mind, the critical thing was the government was going to have to account to the people for any further terrorist incidents.
We were worried about what would happen first and foremost to our soldiers and sailors and airmen and women.
I've sort of always believed in the old cliche that evil prevails when good men do nothing.
Everybody was pretty sombre and nobody was gung-ho, but there was a quiet resolve and a determination and a belief that we'd done the right thing. Good evening. The government has decided to commit Australian forces to action to disarm Iraq because we believe it is right. It is lawful and it's in Australia's national interest. Of all the decisions I took as Prime Minister, going into Iraq was the hardest, the toughest, the most difficult. I have no doubt that if the whole thing had gone bad, it would have been the end for me. I can remember thinking to myself, well, if this whole thing goes bad, they'll know who to blame and I'll take responsibility for it.
2,000 Australian troops were involved in the invasion of Iraq, less than 1% of the coalition forces. To the nation's relief, no Australian soldiers were killed in action.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
The day after George W. Bush declared a premature victory in Iraq, John Howard arrived in Crawford, Texas, for the full VIP treatment at the President's private ranch. These two men had known each other for only 18 months, but the war had sealed a friendship.
Howard is a walker. He likes to walk, and he's not an easy guy to walk with because he keeps a pretty darn good pace.
We stayed with them for the weekend. It was a very enjoyable occasion.
But we love showing them our ranch. You know, it's just a special place for me and Laura. It's our home.
Two things were apparent. One was the genuine depth of the personal relationship between the Prime Minister and the President, and the extent to which the President wanted to make sure that the Prime Minister was fully briefed on any issue on which he wanted to know about, and so on.
The next day, the two leaders held a joint press conference.
We were essentially expecting a fairly straight up and down press conference.
The Prime Minister showed he's not only a man of steel, he showed the world he's a man of heart as well.
And then Bush made the reference to John Howard as the man of steel.
It came from my immense vocabulary.
My friends might agree with it. My enemies will scoff at it, won't they? An old saying in Australian politics, if you want a mate, get a dog.
That's right.
John Howard's enemies were about to be handed more ammunition. Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. The primary justification for the war did not exist.
Today, the inquiry by former intelligence chief Philip Flood confirmed Australia's spy agencies got it wrong.
And the intelligence was thin, ambiguous and inaccurate. And Australia shared in a general intelligence failure.
Everyone assumed from the Secretary-General of the United Nations downwards, everybody assumed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. That really wasn't a subject of conjecture. I was very surprised that they weren't found.
I often think the simplest thing for us to have been in retrospect is just to have published the intelligence assessments rather than actually the government compile a report about them. What we should actually have done is just publish them.
The intelligence assessments may, in the final analysis, have turned out to be defective because stockpiles of WMD were not found, although programs and the capacity to generate stockpiles was certainly found. But we didn't take the country to war based on a lie. We didn't invent the intelligence.
John Howard had survived the war in Iraq. His future seemed secure. But he had another battle to fight. It was coming up to his 64th birthday.
Peter flew to Canberra on Monday and rang me from the car on his way to the office and told me that the Prime Minister had asked him to go around and see him to have a chat. And I said, "What do you think it's about? Do you think he's got something to tell you?" And he said, "I think he's going to tell me what his decision is."
3 years earlier, on his 61st birthday, John Howard had signalled he'd rethink his future before he turned 64. The Treasurer hoped the Prime Minister might retire, but John Howard had news for him.
Peter came round to the PM's office and they had a discussion, went for about an hour or so.
He told me he'd decided to stay, and he pushed a piece of paper across the coffee table which had a formulation of words on it. He said he was going to read that formulation of words out to the party room the next day, and it was a formulation that he would be staying as long as the party wanted him to.
There had been a form of words discussed with people in the office and I think outside the office, which sought to give the Prime Minister some further room, I think, to be able to consider his future without being hemmed in by artificial deadlines.
I obviously tried to engage him in conversation. I tried to persuade him that this was not the best decision for the Liberal Party.
We were both engaged in the discussions, but we weren't angry with each other. We weren't yelling at each other.
I said we ought to renew the party. I thought that we had an opportunity to go to the 2004 election with new leadership, that this would be in the interests of the Liberal Party, and we had a discussion, but he said he'd made up his mind. And that was it.
I still felt very fit, I was still very engaged, I was still very committed, and it was clear to me that the overwhelming majority of my colleagues wanted me to stay.
Peter was gutted and shocked. He wasn't expecting it.
He came back, he didn't say anything to anyone. He walked past my office. I could see his face was a bit dark.
Peter rang me and said that he'd just had a meeting with John Howard and he wasn't going. And I think Peter was stunned. He was incredibly upset. He was devastated.
Peter Costello may have been disappointed, but when John Howard announced his decision to stay on, the Coalition party room responded quite differently.
I remember
Jeannie Ferris applauding very loudly from the front row, as though it was the best thing that had ever happened.
Well, there certainly was applause, yes. There was a lot of applause, yes. There was. There was a lot of applause.
Oh, there's always applause. I mean, whenever John Howard said that he was going to stay, there was always applause.
Yeah, no, great ovation and excitement. There's no doubt about that.
Well, there are always plenty of people ready to applaud the Prime Minister.
Were you disappointed? Well, it wasn't my happiest day, put it that way.
I think after that day, Peter went into a bit of a funk.
I mean, the Prime Ministership doesn't work on the basis of Buggin's turn, you know. Not everybody has a turn. He was in a good position to become the Prime Minister, but that wasn't to say that anyone owed him the Prime Ministership. I mean, it's one of those things you have to get. You have to get somehow or other. You need a cunning plan. That's how to become the Prime Minister.
My attitude was that this was a decision that he had made. It was going to be his last term, 2004. That there was no point in rocking the boat, that it was much better to concentrate on winning that 2004 election. And if I concentrated on winning the 2004 election, in the interests of the party, then an opportunity would come later for me.
I never had any sort of difficulty in understanding his ambition. And it's the ultimate prize in Australian politics. And if you can become the Prime Minister of Australia by what you might call by internal succession, that's good. Very good. And I could understand that.
John Howard's birthday soon. What are you going to give him?
I'll send him a card, I think.
Oh, that's a bit mean. What about a present?
Happy birthday, Prime Minister. Enjoy your week.
Thank you. Good morning. How are you? I'll leave that there. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I've got a fantastic team.
With his leadership secured, the Prime Minister turned his attention to defeating Simon Crean. There was just one problem. By December 2003, it was clear that Simon Crean would not be given the chance to lead the Labor Party to the next election. Labor would choose between Kim Beazley or the untested Mark Latham.
The result of the ballot was 47 votes for Mark Latham, 45 for Kim Beazley.
Good luck, mate.
Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Simon.
Latham had won by 2 votes, which surprised me.
I remember vividly John Howard putting his hands together and looking up and saying, "Thank you, Lord," and then corrected himself because he knew that that moment of hubris or that moment of excitement might come back to bite. And, geez, for a few months it certainly looked like that.
He got off to a rip-roaring start.
And where's his best friend, Buzz Lightyear?
He started off with doing some fairly unfamiliar things to the Prime Minister, like sitting on the floor and reading to children.
Goodness, what's Woody going to do? Is Woody going to sort out the problem and rescue everyone?
People forget this. Latham actually got out to a large lead. In fact, I can tell you through 2004, John Howard on a number of occasions addressed the party room on the possibility of us losing the 2004 election. We were behind in the polls. Latham was connecting with the public. He had a very good radio manner and a good turn of phrase.
If a federal election is held this year, say the election was in September and there was a change of government, we'd be hoping to have them back by Christmas, certainly.
But then when the Iraq issue came along, getting the troops out by Christmas, then the wheels started to come off a bit for Latham.
And I don't think he ever really recovered from that because people deep down sort of revealed a fundamental irresponsibility and a shoot-from-the-hip approach, and that's what I always thought he was like.
In August 2004, sensing he had Mark Latham's measure, John Howard decided it was time to go to the polls.
This election, ladies and gentlemen, will be about trust.
The Labor Party was really focusing on you cannot trust John Howard. You can't trust him because he's done this, that and the other thing. Don't trust him.
Who do you trust to lead the fight on Australia's behalf against international terrorism. Now, I thought the best way to deal with that whole thing was to really take the issue of trust head on and make it an issue of who do you really trust to run the economy? Who do you trust to keep interest rates low? Who do you trust to keep the budget strong?
And by the way, you're not allowed to spin your own number. No, I know that. 42.
With polling day inching closer, both parties played a game of cat and mouse on the issue of green preferences, with each waiting for the other to release their Tasmanian forest policy. Mark Latham blinked first, announcing an $800 million package to protect old-growth forests.
There will be no net loss of forestry jobs under Labor's policy.
This is Mark Latham's $800 million bet. He's punting that he can gain Green support without losing Labor's Tasmanian timber seats.
Thank you very much.
About putting Blue Tier and Mount Arthur.
I watched the union people outside the building waiting to talk to him and him going out the back door, and I thought this is extraordinary.
We're yet to see what John Howard's policy is.
It was as good an example as I can recall of my prime ministership, when going with your gut instinct was the right thing to do. I had thought about the idea of a big green package, and most of my advisors, almost to a man and a woman, had said you ought to. And yet right when I got to the point of going in that direction, something held me back.
John Howard had decided on a package that favoured jobs over forests. The Prime Minister and his team arrived in Launceston aware this was a pivotal moment of the campaign.
We saw all these big trucks outside, all these rather burly individuals in their forestry gear, and we thought, well, this will be an interesting day. And of course, he walked in there, walked onto the stage, and he got a rapturous reception.
But there has to be a solution that is both environmentally friendly and fair to local communities and doesn't ask of a small number of Australians to carry the burden of what the great majority of Australians want.
And then I went down amongst them and shaking hands and embracing.
Thanks, Mr. Howard.
I thought, this is an extraordinary experience. Many of them had tattoos on their arms and flannel shirts, and they were quintessential blue-collar workers. But in a sense, I was keeping faith with the Howard battlers.
Nice class. In you go, Alan.
Wait a minute.
By election eve, the coalition was confident of victory. And now, Mark Latham was doing everything to help.
How are you, Mark?
Good. How are you?
I'm very well.
Good to see you. You too.
Okay. What I can say about that handshake is that I knew it was coming. And the reason I knew it was coming was that on the night of the debate at Channel 9, the cameras weren't on us, but he did the same thing to me.
Hey, Mark. John, good. How are you?
Very well. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
So I recall very vividly when I knew that we were going to shake hands outside that radio studio, I said to myself, this bloke will do the same thing as he did at Channel 9. And right on cue, he did. How are you, Mark?
Good. How are you?
I'm very well.
Good to see you.
It was very silly. I know it offended a very large number of women.
It was only a matter of giving him enough rope and, he'd blow up.
On the 9th of October 2004, Australia voted. And with an early daylight saving, the first results that night came in from Tasmania.
And we'll look first at two of the seats which are causing problems, certainly the seat of Braddon, which may well be lost to Labor, and the seat of Bass, which is also seriously in doubt.
The first results that came in from Bass and Braddon did show very heavy swings.
Michelle, do you think at this stage, in fact, you look as if you are suffering some of the expected backlash from Mark Latham's forest policy?
And it was obvious from then that the Labor Party was in trouble in both of those seats, and I felt to myself then that it was inconceivable, really, that they could win enough seats from us on the mainland.
I can remember on election night 2004, he put his arm around me. He said, "Mate, I don't think we ever thought 10 years ago this was going to happen." And would never have dreamed that the John Howard who was in trouble in the mid-80s, and you couldn't give him away, that all of a sudden he just won a 4th term as Prime Minister of this country. That really was extraordinary turnaround.
I mean, if you'd have said to me in 1996 that we'd win not only that election but the 3 subsequent elections, I'd have just said, well, that's wishful thinking, go away. I thought it was beyond all my wildest dreams politically.
John Howard was now as powerful as any Prime Minister in Australian history.
It led a lot of colleagues to believe that we were invincible. We'd come from behind so many times. We'd had that 10-goal last quarter in AFL terms that we'd be able to do it again. Whereas really what 2004 gave us was a great opportunity most political parties don't get, and that was an early warning of what would happen if we didn't have some generational change. And I thought John Howard would have seen that, being the student of history that he is and being the astute politician that he was, that he had a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Well, I have heard people say that Latham was a get-out-of-jail-free card for the Coalition. One will never know that. But a win is a win.
In fact, the Coalition increased its vote and its majority in the Parliament. The size of the victory would give John Howard enormous authority within his own party. But no leader, however powerful, can forever avoid the issue of succession. Would John Howard, like his hero Sir Robert Menzies, choose the time of his own departure? Or would the public do it for him?